The tension in the cabin was palpable as the younger man took another step forward, his gaze fixed on the elderly veteran. His hands trembled slightly, and when he finally spoke, his voice wavered. "Sir, were you in the 173rd Airborne? Vietnam?" The veteran's weathered face tightened with surprise. He tilted his head, scrutinizing the man before him. "Yeah," he said cautiously. "How'd you know that?" The man exhaled shakily. My father was in the 173rd. He always talked about his unit, the men he served with. He used to tell me about a guy named Sergeant James, the one who saved his life during an ambush near Dak 2. He said he never got to thank him. The cabin fell into complete silence. Every passenger, every flight attendant, every pair of eyes was locked onto the two men. The veteran stiffened, his fingers gripping the armrest. "Your father, what was his name?" The younger man took another unsteady breath. "David Carter." A slow inhale. The veteran blinked, his jaw tightening as if a flood of memories had just crashed over him. "Carter," he murmured, almost to himself. His gaze drifted, unfocused for a moment, as if he was seeing a battlefield instead of an airplane cabin. Then, he let out a rough, emotional chuckle. "Your father was a good man, brave as hell. I remember that night. He got hit bad. We weren't sure he'd make it, but we weren't leaving him behind." The younger man swallowed hard, blinking back tears. "He never forgot you. He said if it weren't for you, I wouldn't be here today. He always wanted to find you, to say thank you, but he never got the chance. He passed away last year." The veteran's lips pressed together, his chest rising and falling heavily. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, he reached out his hand, and the younger man clasped it tightly. "You just gave me that chance," the veteran said gruffly, "and I'd do it all over again." A sniffle broke the silence from somewhere in the cabin. A woman dabbed at her eyes. A man near the window discreetly wiped his face. Even the flight attendants seemed frozen in place, absorbing the weight of what had just unfolded before them. Then, quietly at first, applause began. It started with a few claps, then spread until the entire cabin was on their feet. Passengers cheered, some shaking their heads in awe at the sheer gravity of what they had just witnessed. Sylvester Stallone, who had been standing off to the side, watched with a small, knowing smile. He had given up his seat to honor a veteran, but he had never expected this, an unplanned reunion, a moment decades in the making. As the applause settled, the flight attendant approached Stallone with a gentle smile. "Sir, we'd like to upgrade you to another seat in first class. You don't have to go to economy." Stallone chuckled, shaking his head. "Nah, I'm good. I'll take the back seat. I think I just witnessed something more important than any first-class experience." With that, he gave the veteran a respectful nod and headed toward the back of the plane. As he passed down the aisle, passengers reached out to shake his hand, offering murmurs of appreciation. Meanwhile, the younger man took the empty seat beside the veteran. "Would you mind if I sat here for a bit?" he asked hesitantly. The veteran nodded, his lips curling into a small smile. "I'd like that, son." As the plane took off, the hum of the engines blended with quiet conversations, some about the moment they had all just witnessed, others about life, about gratitude, about fate, and in the midst of it all, two men, connected by a war, by sacrifice, by history, sat side by side, sharing a moment neither of them ever expected to have. That flight was just another trip for most passengers, but for those who had been paying attention, it was something far greater. It was a reminder that small gestures of kindness can lead to extraordinary moments, that fate has a way of bringing people together, and that the impact of one person's actions can ripple across generations. And as Stallone leaned back in his economy seat, staring out at the clouds beyond the window, he smiled, because in that moment, he knew he had just been part of something truly unforgettable. His entire body tense with the weight of a story he had spent his whole life searching for. His breath hitched as he clutched the photograph tighter, his fingers pressing into its worn edges as if trying to hold onto something tangible, something real. The father he had never met, the man who had given his life so another could live. This was the closest he had ever been to him. Frank, the veteran, exhaled slowly, his tired eyes heavy with years of unspoken grief. I carried that guilt for a long time, he admitted, wondering why it was me that made it home and not him. Why I gotta live my life while his ended there, in the dirt, so far from home. The younger man swallowed hard. You did make it home, he said, his voice raw. And because of that, I'm here. My father's sacrifice wasn't just for you. It was for me, too. For the life I got to live because he never made it back. The words settled like a quiet storm, rolling through the cabin, thick with emotion. Stallone, standing off to the side, his arms crossed over his chest, let out a slow breath. He had intended to make a small gesture of kindness, giving up his seat for a veteran. He never expected it to unravel into something so profound. A flight attendant, her eyes red-rimmed, sniffled softly. A passenger near the front discreetly wiped at his eyes. No one had expected this. No one could have scripted it. Frank nodded, pressing his lips together. Then, with slow, deliberate movements, he reached forward and grasped the younger man's hand. Their fingers locked, firm, unshaking. A silent understanding passed between them. Your father was a hero, Frank said, voice steady but thick with emotion. And I see a part of him in you. The younger man inhaled sharply, his throat too tight for words. He simply nodded, his grip on Frank's hand tightening. Then, something incredible happened. A woman seated near the aisle stood up, her voice trembling with emotion. My grandfather served in Vietnam, she said, her hands clasped together. He never talked about it. I never got to hear his stories, but I wish I had. Thank you both. Another passenger stood, then another. One by one, people rose from their seats. A wave of silent gratitude spreading through the cabin. A few clapped softly. Some simply stood in quiet respect. But in that moment, every person on that plane bore witness to something far greater than themselves. Frank, overwhelmed, shook his head in disbelief. I never thought. He stopped, unable to finish the thought. Instead, he let the moment settle, his gaze locked with the man sitting before him. You gave me something I never thought I'd have, the younger man whispered. You gave me my father. Frank exhaled sharply, nodding once, his expression softening. And you gave me peace. The silence stretched for a few moments longer before the flight attendant finally cleared her throat, her voice unsteady. Ladies and gentlemen, she said softly, thank you. Her eyes landed on Stallone. And thank you, Mr. Stallone, for making this moment possible. Stallone shook his head, a small, humble smile on his lips. I just gave up a seat, he said. They did the rest. As the passengers slowly took their seats again, the energy in the cabin had shifted. The air felt lighter, charged with something that wasn't just respect, it was connection, a shared humanity. Frank leaned back, a quiet smile playing on his lips. The younger man still held the photograph, his fingers running over the faded edges as if memorizing every detail. He wasn't ready to put it away yet. As Stallone finally made his way toward the back of the plane, settling into an economy seat, he glanced out the window at the setting sun. The sky was painted in hues of gold and crimson, stretching endlessly beyond the horizon. He had boarded this flight expecting nothing but another routine trip. Instead, he had witnessed something extraordinary, a reminder that sometimes the smallest gestures lead to the most unforgettable moments, that fate has a way of bringing people together when they need it most, and that heroes never truly fade, not as long as their stories live on. Sylvester Stallone's simple gesture unveils a 50-year-old secret. As the wheels touched down on the tarmac, the cabin remained eerily silent. No one reached for their bags. No one rushed to stand. It was as if the entire plane was suspended in the weight of what had just happened, a moment none of them had expected, but one that had changed them all. Frank Delaney sat back in his seat, his rough hands folded in his lap, his gaze distant but no longer burdened by the ghosts of the past. Across from him, the son of Daniel Harrington still held the weathered notebook close to his chest, as if afraid that letting go might erase the connection he had just found. For 50 years, he had searched for pieces of his father, and now, on an ordinary flight, He had found them in the most unexpected way. He had heard the stories, seen the handwriting, and felt the legacy his father had left behind through the words of the man who had survived because of him. Stallone, sitting a few rows back now, exhaled slowly, watching the scene unfold. He had merely given up his seat, thinking it was a small gesture of gratitude to a veteran. But fate had taken that moment and woven it into something extraordinary. The flight attendant's voice broke the silence. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Phoenix, Arizona. Local time is 4:17 p.m. Please remain seated until we reach the gate." Yet, no one moved. No one wanted to disturb what had just unfolded before them. The younger Harrington turned to Frank, his voice thick with emotion. Would you tell me more about him? When we land, if you're not in a rush?" Frank's weathered face softened. He nodded. "I'd like that, son. I'd like that a lot." The plane rolled toward the gate, but inside, time felt frozen. Passengers exchanged quiet glances, some still wiping away tears. A woman across the aisle turned to Stallone and whispered, "You started all of this." Stallone shook his head. "No," he said with a small smile. "I just gave up a seat." The woman gave him a knowing look. Sometimes, that's all it takes. As the plane came to a complete stop and the seatbelt signs dinged off, the usual scramble for overhead bins never came. Instead, a quiet reverence filled the space. A few passengers reached out to shake Frank's hand as they passed. Others clapped him on the shoulder, their eyes filled with respect. One young man in a hoodie and backpack lingered for a moment. "My grandpa fought in Vietnam," he said, his voice unsteady. "I never got to know him, but I think I understand him a little more now." "Thank you." Frank nodded, patting the kid's arm. "He was one of the good ones, I'm sure." As Stallone grabbed his carry-on and turned toward the exit, he felt a hand on his shoulder. He turned to see Frank looking at him, his expression unreadable. "You didn't have to do what you did," Frank said, his voice low but filled with meaning. Stallone smiled. "Yeah, I did." Frank nodded once before turning back to Harrington's son. They walked off the plane together, two strangers now bound by a story that had waited half a century to be told. As Stallone stepped into the bright Arizona sun, he let out a long breath, feeling something shift inside him. He had been in movies about heroes, but today, he had witnessed real ones. Sometimes, the most powerful moments come from the simplest acts, and sometimes, all it takes to change a life, or bring closure to one, is an empty seat and a willing heart. Sylvester Stallone's selfless gesture unveils a 50-year-old secret. Slowly, people began stirring, but the weight of the moment still hung thick in the air. Frank exhaled deeply, rubbing his hands over his knees as if shaking off the past. The man, the son of his fallen brother in arms, was still holding onto the notebook, his fingers gripping the worn leather like a lifeline. Stallone adjusted his jacket and turned to Frank. "You got someone picking you up?" Frank chuckled, shaking his head. "Nah, son. My legs still work. Got a rental waiting." The man next to him furrowed his brow. "Do you live in Phoenix?" Frank hesitated. "Tucson. Just passing through." The man let out a breath, his grip tightening around the notebook. "Listen," he stopped himself, struggling to find the right words. Then, after a pause, he shook his head with a small smile. "I don't even know what to say." Frank patted his arm gently, his own voice softer now. "You don't have to say anything." The seatbelt sign turned off, and the usual chaos of landing should have begun. Passengers scrambling for overhead bins, pushing toward the aisle, muttering about connections and baggage claims. But not today. Not on this flight. People moved slower, more deliberate. Some offered Frank small nods of respect as they passed. A woman in business attire reached out, squeezing his shoulder gently before moving along. A flight attendant paused beside him, her voice laced with genuine emotion. "Thank you for your service." Frank nodded, his throat too tight to respond. And then, as Stallone gathered his things, Frank turned toward him one last time. "Mr. Stallone?" Stallone looked up, one hand on his carry-on. "Yeah." Frank held his gaze, his expression unreadable. "What you did back there," he nodded slightly, his voice quieter now. "You didn't just give up a seat." Stallone's expression softened. "No, I didn't." Frank let out a breath and extended his hand. Stallone grasped it firmly, shaking it with the same strength that had carried both of them through this moment. The veteran's voice dropped to just above a whisper. "I think I got the better deal." Stallone smiled, but his eyes carried something deeper. As Frank and the man, the son of the friend he lost, walked toward the terminal together, Stallone watched them go, a quiet thought settling deep in his chest. Greatness isn't measured by fame or fortune. It's measured in moments like this. And as he stepped off that plane, he knew this was a flight he'd never forget. Sometimes, the smallest gestures, a seat, a conversation, a simple act of kindness, can lead to something far greater than we ever expected. This story isn't just about Sylvester Stallone or a veteran. It's about all of us. It's about the way we treat people, the opportunities we have to change lives, and the moments we don't see coming. You never know when something as simple as a decision, a single moment of generosity, might set off a chain of events that someone has been waiting for their entire life. So the next time you have a chance to do something good, do it, because you never know whose story you might be stepping into. A lesson in kindness and human connection. The story of Sylvester Stallone's selfless act reminds us that kindness, no matter how small, can create ripples far beyond what we imagine. A simple decision, to give up a seat, unveiled a lifetime of memories, reconnected a family, and honored a forgotten hero. In our daily lives, we often rush past opportunities to show compassion, but moments of generosity, empathy, and human connection can change lives in ways we may never see. So take the time to listen, to help, and to care, because sometimes a single act of kindness can become someone's defining moment.